and welcome to the Art of Being Human. We've been talking about what it is like to lose a loved one, a partner, being a widow, being a widower. I focused on being a widow. However, what I'm saying can apply to anyone who's lost a loved one through death, any kind of a partner, or even moving or separation or something like that. And I've tried to explain also that the grief that you feel is different than depression. Depression can be long-lasting, but it's also very treatable. And you can react normally if the depression is not too deep. You can react normally to life, and you can have a life, and you can be treated, and you can feel better. And most times, you can have such relief from depression that as long as you're getting the therapy you need and the medication that you need, you can actually live a normal life. Grief is hard-hitting. It's not meant to last forever. Although when a person is grief-stricken, it is as if they feel that they won't be able to get out of it. They think that that loss and that grief is going to last forever, but it doesn't. It lasts for a certain amount of time, but there's no time limit that you can put on it, because for some people it can last for years. Most people, within a few days, they start to feel better. Not particularly right, but at least better. The deepest grief puts you in kind of a mode. I don't know how else to explain it. And it's like a deep mode, and you're not perceiving things like you normally do, and you're not taking pleasure in things like you normally do. It's like a certain type of existence that you're in, and everything is different, and everything is changed, and you are not like the same person. But then you move out of it, and when you start to move out of it, things seem better, things seem more normal, but then you may slip back into it again. So it's like a separate kind of existence, a separate way of living, and then you finally move out of it, and gradually it goes away. I mention that because how do you get well from grief? Well, if you look at the way that you get well when you've had surgery, and I've had surgery numerous times, but the first few days when you're out of the hospital, you really don't feel good. There's no energy. You're uncomfortable. You may have pain. You may be tired. And then you might have 2 or 3 days where you're absolutely miserable and you're wondering why you even bothered with treatment. And then suddenly you have a day that's not so bad. It may not be as what you want it to be, but it's not so bad. And then you slip into, I don't feel good again. And then you have 2 days that are better, and then 1 or 2 days that are bad, then 3 days that are better, and 1 day that's bad. And gradually what happens is that you pull out of it as your body is getting well, and you have more times when you're feeling good than the times that you're feeling bad. But that doesn't mean you don't feel bad, but it's not as often. It doesn't last as long. It's not quite so intense. This is the way that you feel as you're healing from, say, major surgery. Well, I liken that to how you heal when you have grief, because you're so grief-stricken, all you can think of is the person who died. And how are you going to get along without that person that died? And that lasts for a while, and then you start forging a new reality. As you start expressing the feelings that you have, you start to forge another reality, and it might make you nervous. You don't want a new reality. You want the reality that you had, and that's a part of the grief process. Then you have the symptoms of anger and all of this kind of thing that people go through. Anger, hostility, temper tantrums, wishing that you could go back to an earlier time, fearful of the new reality because you're not sure you could keep up with it. It might be too much for you, and on it goes. But gradually you start to adapt to the new reality, and it seems more normal to you. And then as it seems more normal to you, you start behaving in a different kind of way. You start looking at life in a different kind of way. Well, this is it. This is where I am, and this is what I'm going to do. And you become more realistic about life and less in that mode that you get into when you're grief-stricken. Those episodic pangs is what they're called, when you just have to have that person back. You can't live without that person. You can't have a normal life without that person. How are you going to do it? Now, I have counseled people who have lost both parents at the same time in an accident. There was one little girl that I counseled for a while, and she had a real problem. Both her parents went off on a trip. They got into an accident. They both died. She suddenly is parentless. And she was young. She needed to have a parent. She needed to have people around that could act as her parent. And part of her therapy, I'm sure, when I referred her, would be to have her learn how to live, but also to let other people parent her as if they were her parents. Now, it doesn't mean it would bring her parents back, but she needed the guidance of a person who was more experienced with life and this kind of thing. So it's a slow process, but it doesn't last forever. And in fact, depression probably lasts a lot longer than grief does for most people. But when you physically get well, it's a gradual process, and suddenly you have a day or so which seems pretty normal. And then as you go on, more normality, and that which you suffered from gets less and less and less. And you know that you're healing. So when I do funerals, I give a little bit of information about the healing process, and I tell people, when you can live your life and you're thinking more about other things, not just the person who died, but you're thinking about other things, and you're able to do that, and it seems natural to do that, then you actually started the healing process. So I want to go into some other people's deaths. We've been talking about the psychologist because she wrote such a good book about it, but I want to go into other people who have died and what their spouses left, how they rebuilt their lives again. Now, you remember John McCain. John McCain was a senator, and he died of cancer of the brain, glioblastoma, which is a special cancer of the brain. And you probably, if you know a little history and you're not too older and you're not too young, you remember that Ted Kennedy died, and he died of the same kind of cancer. So I want to mention that cancer. There are some people who believe that if you stand too close to a microwave, or if you have your phone next to your ear all the time, you will develop a cancer in that place where the phone is. Now, the thing is, there has been some research done to indicate that microwaves, telephones, cell telephones, and so forth, they produce a kind of wavelength that's conducive to forming cancer. And the research is, if you take a group of cattle and you put them in a field, but you have, posts with wires on them, and so basically they're under the influence of whatever those wires are sending out, or if they're radio waves or whatever it is that they're sending out. A number of those cattle will develop cancer. If you take that all away and put these cattle in a field and there's no electronic information, no electronic devices, no wires, nothing like that, no posts, they don't develop cancer. And so with research, that's only part of it, of course. I'm not going into all of it. There is some indication that if you have a cell phone and you're on it half the time, like I am, and you keep putting it up to your brain or put it up to your head, that's the area of the brain that's going to get the cancer. So now some of the phones, or people have decided that they need to use another device. You still use the phone, but they have to be a certain distance away from it so they don't catch those waves in the brain and don't develop cancer, or not so apt to develop cancer. Now, I worked in the field of telecommunications as I was getting some advanced degrees from the university where I was, and I was using telephone equipment. And we had a brand new building, a new telecommunications building, had a lot of equipment in it, lots of computers, lots of telephone equipment. They had a special room for a lot of that equipment. But I was seated next to a wall, and right next to the other room where I was seated next to the wall was a lot of electronic equipment related to telephones. And the research came out and said there's a possibility that unless you're a certain distance away, you can get the waves in your brain and you can develop cancer. So they gave us a choice. I worked with several other people. We could be moved across the street to another building, and they would just wire all of the equipment we need. They would wire it in, so we wouldn't be next to anything that would cause cancer, or we could stay. Well, we didn't want to be separated from anybody else, and so we decided to stay. But the cancer, if it would develop, would be several years later. Now, that was a long time ago. I've been retired for quite a while. I never developed cancer, so I must have been far enough away. And it's not a given that you'll have cancer, but a lot of people do get cancer from that cell phones, especially if they're holding them close to their bodies. Cancer may develop in time. Manufacturers of cell phones will tell you that there's no direct evidence that you can get cancer, although they're aware of the allegations and they're aware that some people do develop cancer, but they don't consider that their phones or their equipment shoves enough out in terms of radio waves or whatever it is to cause cancer. But there is some evidence for it. So when I talk about John McCain, that's the kind of cancer he died from. And Ted Kennedy had died from it previously, the same kind of cancer in the same area of the brain. Now, John McCain's wife, whose name was Cindy, stayed out of the public eye for quite a while. There were 7 children. Now, I've said before that if you don't have children, it may be easier because you don't have anyone that's relying upon you to be healthy and to be a breadwinner. This was a blended family, and there were 7 children involved, although they were fairly well grown up. She found that it was a great help to have those children there. To nurture them and to help them through that grief process also helped her. It also kept her busy. Something about funerals, they keep you busy. There's a lot of things you have to do before a funeral if you're going to have a good funeral, and it keeps you so busy, especially during that shock phase that you go through when you've lost somebody, that the real pain of the loss sometimes doesn't really kick in until after the funeral is over. She worked with these children, and she got them so they went through the grief process, and that helped her too. And as usual, if you're helping somebody else, you turn out and be helped by it as well. If you're teaching somebody else, a lot of times you will be helped by it because you will be, in a sense, teaching yourself at the same time that you're teaching somebody else. A lot of teachers remark about how much they know as a result of the things that they've taught. They did the research, they did the teaching, and as a result of that, they have a lot of things they know that they didn't know before. So it reinforces your own learning. So she worked with these kids, and she stayed out of the public eye for about I don't know for how long, but for a period of time, a good year anyway. And then she started a foundation, and the foundation is geared into fighting for the causes that John McCain felt that he wanted to fight for. So she was going to take up his battles and fight for him because he was no longer there. Now, a foundation is usually formed to honor the memory of a person who has a position of fame or glory, or they were a past president, or they had some accomplishments, and the foundation kind of preserves their memory. But it also brings in a good deal of money. And I don't pay too much attention to foundations because I know what the purpose is. They do a lot of books, they made films, anything to keep the memory alive of the person that's died. So this is what she is doing. And in order to do that, she has to get into the public eye once again. any politician is in the public eye, but if a spouse dies, they may retreat and not be in the public eye, but then step forward again in a foundation or some organization that's designed to keep the memory alive. Then she gets back into it again. Now, does it increase her grief that she has to go through? Well, eventually that grief should subside anywhere. But she's saying things like, you have to learn to live with a broken heart. And we do, but as the grief subsides, you should be able to live every day like a person that doesn't have a lot of grief. Once in a while, you'll slip back into it, but you don't have to slip back into it often. It sometimes comes upon you. There's a part of the brain that records not only the memories of the things that have happened to you, but the emotions that you experienced at the time. So when you start thinking and remembering things, not only do you remember the thing that happened to you, you lost somebody or you're in a bad accident, whatever it is, but you also re-experience the emotions like they were fresh, like it was coming again new. And I call that reliving your past pain. And it's not the scientific name for it, but I think it describes it rather well. You live your past pain. It's like it came back up. You're re-experiencing it like you're going through it the first time because you get the same intensity of the emotions. Gradually, of course, that fades away so that you can live a normal life and you're not haunted by what's happened to you in the past. It comes once in a while. You have some moments of grief. You have some moments of remembering. You have some moments where you wish things were different, but they're not, and you do the best you can with it. But it's not like an everyday experience that haunts you. You just don't have to have that. So she started the foundation. She works in the foundation. It's a very public thing. And her goal is to keep John McCain's memory alive. Not only that, but to fight for the causes that he fought for. And how they do that, probably, I don't know how they do that, except maybe create movies about him, create things that happen, review things that happen, maybe produce some of his speeches again so people can read them, and this kind of thing. And that's not an uncommon thing to do with a politician in Washington, to observe what happened and to honor them during certain periods of time, like, for example, a year after their death, going back and making movies of it, what happened to them, and keeping the memory alive. This has helped her with her grief. You have to remember that what helps somebody with their grief, it might be a reminder of grief, and it may not be good for somebody else. But what works for one person may not work with another. Normally speaking, you gradually get out of the episodic pain and you just go on with your life. And then if you adapt well enough, you get to like the life that you have, the new life that you have. It has benefits to it. And you don't have to be squashed by the memories that you have. They're there, but they don't have to haunt you. The idea of healing, I think, is to be able to remember something, because you're never really going to forget it. Your memories may change. They may be inaccurate as you remember more and more as time goes by. The quality of the memory may change. You may mistake some things. You may not remember things quite as accurately as you did. But the thing is, it doesn't have to grab you and haunt you and throw you back into a trauma state again. That's when you know that you're being healed of it, and that does happen. So in terms of her, she has the foundation. She works with people. She keeps his memory alive. And in the end, this does seem to help her with her grief. For another person, and I'm going to probably talk about this next session, but if you remember, there was a killer, Charles Manson. And Charles Manson was a sociopath. A sociopath has no sense of right and wrong. Whatever they want, they do. They don't care. They don't care if they hurt anybody. They don't care if they kill anybody. So what? It's life. As far as they're concerned, there's no sense of grief. There's no sense of I did something wrong. There's just no sense of moral value. Well, what happened with him was he gained about 4 or 5 people around him, and as he was a serial killer, he gained some people who also he trained to kill. And they revered him, and they thought he was wonderful, and he started controlling their minds. And so he went out, or they went out, and they killed a group of people. And one of the people that they killed was Sharon Tate. Now, Sharon Tate was an actress, and she was pregnant. So both she died and the baby she carried died. Now, they all ended up in prison. And what Sharon Tate's sister does, which is not helpful to her grief, is her main purpose in life is to make sure they all stay in prison. She attends parole hearings. She attends all of that and reminds everybody of what they did, how awful it was, and that they should not get parole and they should remain in prison. And that's what she does. She considers that to be her life's work, is to make sure that they are punished for what they did and that the punishment does not stop and that they never get their freedom. Now, this is not helpful to her in terms of her grief. The problem with that is that it's always bringing it back. She's always remembering it in the worst way possible, and she never has the closure that she needs. Now, I understand why she wants to do what she does, and there are legitimate reasons for that, but it just does not help with the grief. And so she talks about the fact that every time she goes before a parole board arguing that a person should stay in jail because of what they've done, then she goes through that grief all over again. There are things that can be helpful. There are things that may be necessary but are not helpful in terms of getting closure. Closure is important. You really need to have closure, because if you can have closure, this closes a chapter, but it opens up another chapter. And so if you can open up another chapter, then you're well off, you're better off, and the grief is better. So it just, just to compare what the grief process is like, it's going to be different for different people. The lengths of time is going to be different for different people. You can't put a time limit on it. You can't say that you will be done grief within 2 months or 3 months. Usually it's to get completely over it. I'm not sure you ever get completely over it, but you can get so much better that you can live a normal life and not be hounded by it. And you may actually get to like the life that you have. So I'm going to close it here. We'll continue with this next time. And so please join me then.